this information, these tools, really helped me process through Dr. Sean. And a lot of people are struggling either with that or with their own losses and things that I think these tools, if we really understand them, it can help us heal. Because honestly, my heart just feels so much better after going through this and doing this. And I can't imagine not having these tools to kind of work through grief, but also kind of help with some closure and some understanding. Everybody kind of came and said, well, he's got, how can he do this when, he has this and he has it. It wasn't really about how can he do this. It's if we're not living life consciously, then we kind of fall to our default, which is like our lowest animal instinct and needs. And so we want to talk about the mind. I don't want to mess around with all the preamble here. I want to just say this outright and as simple as I can. This presentation is about our mind. It's about the field that our mind is, and we'll try to help you understand what a field is, like when we're talking about a quantum field or an M field or the universal field, what that field is. But I want to make that point clear that we're talking about the mind. We're talking about as a field, like let's say the internet, that's a field. The router generates a field, and there's a finite distance that field spreads out over space. And if we took a reading at each point in that space of that field, there's mathematical representation for the strength of that field or the charge of that field, okay? Think of the mind like that, all right? That router is our brain, though, okay? So it's spread out around us, the mind, and if we're conscious of these other fields that are like interacting with our mind, then we kind of have a higher level of consciousness, and it kind of cancels out those lower energy fields. But if we're not conscious of those things, and I call it living life consciously, then those things really affect us. And like I said, a lot of times they just bring us down to that lowest animal instinct level, where we're just seeking pleasure and running away from pain, okay? And when I started from the beginning on the last presentation, I talked about when God said, let there be light, when we boiled everything in the universe down to its most basic particles, if you want to think of it, everything is light, okay? Every particle, when we break it down and keep breaking it down and dividing it, eventually ends up just a photon or a quantum particle that's basically light vibrating at different frequencies, okay? So light, if you've ever opened a physics book and looked at light, there are three phases, they call it, of light, or phases that we can observe it in. There's the particle phase, like when we fire a laser beam or a particle of a photon of light. It's a photon, is that particle. Then we're talking about one little speck, one particle, okay? But there's also the wave function, and we'll talk about a different study that looks at the particle and the wave functions of light. Not that that's just ultimately important for us to understand, but we also want to talk about the field function of light, or really every particle. So when we broke it down, that energy matter, the line basically between the energy or immaterial and the matter or the material world, okay, the conduit is the field, all right? So when we're talking about that internet again, we can program like a code into that field. Nearly infinite amounts of information can be contained within that field, okay? So the mind is like that, all right? We can, of course, program information to be stored within that field, and we can retrieve it. We can access it by attuning to the frequency of that information, okay? So this represents different particle fields within the universal field, okay? And the field that we probably understand the best would be that electromagnetic field. And it has a definite shape and size, all right? And that field, there's a field that basically surrounds every particle, and all the immaterial specifics of that particle are programmed into that field. So that field actually surrounds everything, all particles, and gives to them their properties. All right? So a particle of gold, like an atom of gold, has a field that surrounds it, and every aspect of that gold is programmed into that field, and then the field actually manifests in physical form by interacting with other fields. We don't want to get into the physics too deep, but it's basically important for us to understand that those fields give the properties, okay? They have to be programmed, that information, those metaphysical specifications, okay? Metaphysical specifications, not a physical one, but the code basically underlying everything that exists, that causes it to exist, gives it context, okay, that exists in that field, all right? Does that make sense? Okay, a little bit. So the fields interact with one another, and they can do that over vast distances because they're all plugged into what we call the unified field or the universal field. So we can take two particles, we can intertwine them, and then we can separate them by great distances, and if we change this particle, it immediately changes that particle, okay, simultaneously. So it gives the effect of information traveling faster than the speed of light, because we can have instantaneous change between these two particles over vast distances, but it's because of the field that links them, okay? So it doesn't actually have to travel over the distance. If it's within that field, it gets the information. It's already programmed into that field. So studies have shown repeatedly then that, the fields of human thought, our mind, that field, it affects fields associated with your body, okay? It can affect our physical health, but it also can affect your loved ones and your circumstances, all right? So those fields have an effect on us physically. That's the point I'm trying to get to here. Those fields, some of them are very low level and they're very basic, okay? So the fields that would be associated with like DNA and a particle or a molecule like that, it's a very complex molecule, but it's called an M field or a morphogenic field. So the field is associated with a form, and that DNA is programming form. So when we look at like a spider web, for example, all the information that spider needs to make that web is programmed into that low-level M field, okay? It's associated with anything that's the same shape and size, those spiders, because they're all that morphology, that form, they access that field. And those spiders are born knowing how to make the specific type of web that each species makes. Each species actually will spin a very specific web specific to their species, okay? Because of that M field that contains all that information that they're just they access it simply by being that form, okay? It's already been programmed in there. Those baby spiders never know their mom. So they don't get that information by watching somebody or learning it. It's programmed in, but it's so complex that it's kind of hard to grasp that they didn't learn this somewhere. It was literally programmed into them. They know how to do that. They know how to access that field. Well, in the same way, our mind accesses those fields without our conscious not living life consciously, conscious of those fields around us, we can access fields that maybe consciously we would never choose, and it's a lower level field. All right. So it's more like we say animalistic. It's go towards pleasure, go away from pain. Okay. Those are very low survival instinct, level fields. That they're programmed, M fields, just to help your body survive, basically. Okay? So, those information stored in a field can be accessed by aligning with that field or tuning into that same frequency. Okay? So, the study that we talked about, that 100th monkey study, just kind of demonstrates that. And real quickly, the study was done on an island in the South Pacific, and there were Japanese scientists on two sides of the island observing monkey, like big families or big societies of monkeys on both sides of this huge mountain range that separates them. And what they would do is every day these monkeys would go down to the river or to the marsh and pull out tubers, and they would eat them. Okay? And every day these scientists are making notes, watching these monkeys on both sides of the island. One day, one of these monkeys goes down and he washes that tuber off in the water and then eats it. The next day, 2, the next day, 3. And when it reached the 100th monkey washing off his tuber before he ate it, all of a sudden on both sides of the island, that field changed, and all of the monkeys on both sides of the island started washing that tuber before they would eat it. And I thought back to that, and I was thinking, what spurred that to happen? Every cause has an effect. What my thinking was, the scientists watching this happen, what they don't realize is just by the mere act of observing a study, you change the outcome. Because your field, okay, your mind is interacting with the field of the monkey mind, which is lower. So automatically, the higher mind, that higher frequency field, the higher consciousness field, he with the most certainty wins. Okay? So if my mind is thinking, man, that monkey should go wash that thing because I'm getting sick of watching him grit dirt in his teeth, that's going to happen. Just by merely affecting it with our thought and our mind, it affects the mind, the M field of those monkeys, and raises that level of consciousness slightly. And so now the entire island is washing their tubers and eating it. So the point of that study, I think, to me was, if you don't live life consciously, and the monkeys weren't, they're not consciously even thinking about it, okay? You default to the predominant field. If that field is a higher consciousness, awesome. But if it's a lower consciousness, not so good, okay? So, when we look at the mind, there are a couple particles. They're called carrier particles because they are responsible for carrying a field with them, okay? So like a graviton, for example, carries what field? Gravity, okay? The electromagnetic field, it's a photon or an electron that carries that field. That particle is responsible for that. So a boson and a fermion are two field/particles, carrier particles, that are associated with the field of our mind, okay? And we can't be both of these at the same time, but we can be one or the other. Most of us are probably a fermion field in our mind, and the boson field is probably more rare in the human experience, but what the boson field, does, it is we call it a state of mind, okay, that is associated with equilibrium. What's equilibrium? It means there's no charge, right? It's not positive or negative. When a positive meets a negative and they balance each other out, that's equilibrium, all right? So that boson field is associated with equilibrium. In that state, those particles, those bosons, can occupy the same space and time, like nearly infinite amounts of them can occupy, they have no mass, they have no charge, so they can occupy the same space and time. That's dang near impossible for our minds to grasp, but here's how I like to use that information, okay? We know that we can, if this is our mind, and these are those bosons, those fields within the field of our mind, each one of those bosons contains information about, let's say, one of our kids, okay, or Jake, or Seneca. It contains the information within your mind that it applies to her, okay? And then, let's say, this one, it contains all the information in that field in your mind that applies to Sequoia, you know? And we have both of these, like, overlapping fields, all right? Within this space in our mind that we reserve for our favorite whatever, okay? So you can look at each of your children. If you're in that state of, we call it a state of unconditional love, where we don't see positive, it's not conditional, it's not based on all positive or negative, okay? We see that person as they are, okay? I skipped it, but St. Augustine said the will of God is equilibrium. That equilibrium is seeing unconditional love. Like, I see all the positive, I see all the negative. It balances out in my mind. That's the boson state, okay? We can say to each of those kids, you're my favorite. You're my favorite. And we're not lying, because they occupy that same space and time in our mind, okay? So, the boson family includes carrier particles like gravitons, photons, gluons. It has no mass, has no charge. It's associated with that state of unconditional love. It sees only equilibrium. There is no positive or negative there. It's not based on an emotion, okay? A person in that state, we say, is at one with the will of God. The will of God is at equilibrium. If you can see that, you're at one with the will of God. So the fermion state is kind of the opposite of that. If you take a boson and you break it in half, you get a positive and a negative fermion. If you take a positive and negative fermion and you bring them together, it balances out into a boson, all right? So the fermion state then, firm ion. Ion means charge, so there's positives and there's negatives, fermions. In that fermion state, our mind is imbalanced. You can't occupy the same space and time in the fermion state. Okay, so everything that, in terms of love or it's conditional in the fermion state. It's based on positives or negatives. And we kind of lie to ourselves in the fermion state of mind. We see, like, all positives over here, or all negatives over here. In reality, both exist, but it's like our mind chooses to ignore one side of that equation, okay? So this is a dangerous state. And this state usually leads to elation and then depression, like bipolar, okay? Where we'll go through these huge undulations between, you know, like a pendulum swing all the way to the positive and then all the way to the negative. And it takes a master to really balance those out, those fluctuations. So this is a conditional state. Usually it's a very emotional state, and usually it's a very exaggerated emotional state. So, like I said, infatuation, I get infatuated with a person or a thing or an activity or whatever, and all I see is the positive there. Eventually that pendulum is going to swing, and I'm going to resent that person or you know, thing or activity. So remember, the will of God is equilibrium. There's a law in the universe called supersymmetry, and that basically just states what he stated is that for every positive there is a negative. We can't actually perceive a positive without the contrast of that negative existing. Our mind wouldn't actually be able to perceive it, so it has to exist. And one of the things that I like to do is, if I'm infatuated with something, I know if I don't balance that charge out and see that equilibrium, I'm eventually going to swing the other direction and resent that, okay? Or likewise, if I'm angry or I resent something or someone, I have to balance that out, you know, because that fluctuation is going to happen, okay? And I don't want to do that bipolar fluctuating. So the will of God is equilibrium. The lie of the enemy is that there's disequilibrium there, okay? So going back to the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, I did this little thought experiment where I said, okay, what was the state of man's mind before the fall? And then what was it after the fall? See, they knew the will of God. They had free will, but the fall takes place the moment that they choose to disobey, because they rationalize in their mind, they believe that lie, that there is more positive than negative to this choice, okay? That's the lie, because the will of God is equilibrium. There's an equal amount of positive and negative here, but it shows, and we do this a lot, we choose to only see the positive or the negative, okay? So knowing good and evil means, okay, splitting that positive and negative. The enemy told them we'll be like God, knowing good and evil. God just sees that equilibrium. But the lie is to believe that there's the positive and the negative there. In fact, it's always going to balance out in the end, okay? The net charge of the universe as a whole is zero, because all the positives and negatives balance out. So another thing that I wanted to hit on here is, I had a hard time kind of being a victim in my mind this last week. And I kind of go back to this. If I perpetuate a lie to myself, okay, and I put all negative charge on a situation like this, each time that I lie to myself, I exaggerate that positive or that negative. In this case, it's been the negative. Okay, I exaggerate that negative. You have to create then this new persona in order to perpetuate that lie. This one's maybe hard to understand, but the one that I usually use is my brother and sister-in-law. He was an addict as well, and when they separated, she had to, in her mind, make him into a monster. Okay, exaggerate the negative. I'm not saying he didn't have negatives, because we all have those positives and negatives, but she had to over-exaggerate the negative and push away and ignore any positive. And what that does is then she becomes a victim. That's her. She has to take on that persona to believe that lie that she's created. Okay? And I'm just saying, that's kind of what I was doing that last week, is I was kind of pushing away the positives that were coming at me at the same time. And I was so blessed by everybody here and everybody who watching, who was reaching out and loving on me. There were so many positives coming in, but I only chose to see the negative there. And I created that, that persona of me as the victim of this situation. Not the case. Okay? I'm very blessed. I would rather have my brother here, but for every negative, there has been a positive, and it's definitely balancing out. Okay? Maybe going to take some time, but what we don't want to do is reach that point where our body then manifests these physical symptoms based on that field. I kind of skipped that study by Dr. Emo, where he takes the water and he writes a word on that, a concept on that bottle of water, and then he freezes it and he looks at the molecular crystal structure. So words that were high energy, high frequency, high consciousness, like love, joy, peace, those froze and it formed just a beautiful crystal. Whereas hate, depression, destruction, those words had a lower frequency vibration, and it shattered those crystals. Literally, it has an effect. Those fields, okay, have an effect on the very molecules that make up our body. So that's what we don't want. We don't want the physical representation representation of subluxation. Remember, sub means less than, lux means divine light, okay? That boson state, unconditional love. And ation means to be in a state of. So subluxation means to be in a state of less than that divine light that we're talking about, that unconditional state, okay? And that's when our body actually manifests that. I told everybody it's not a chiropractic talk, but there's some chiropractic principles in here. And again, this is just due to that supersymmetry. We're going to fluctuate if we have all positives or all negatives. If we put somebody on a pedestal or down in a pit, there's always going to be that bipolar fluctuation, okay? Supersymmetry, it's the law. So C.S. Lewis had a great quote here. He said, if you try to exclude the possibility of suffering, which the order of nature and the existence of free will involves, you'll find that you have excluded life itself. A conversation that I had with the kids was, we're all going to hurt. We're all going through this situation, and there's no way that we get through this without some pain, okay? I think it's a mistake to try and avoid that pain, to try and, find a way around that pain, ignore that pain, bury that pain, medicate that pain, whatever we have to do. To do that with emotional pain, there's going to be consequences to that, because usually that's what gets us in that situation where now we're addicted to something, because we're trying to deaden an emotional pain with a physical, intoxicant, let's say. So we have to kind of embrace that pain, know that there's going to be that negative, okay? We put pain in the negative, definitely, but when we walk through that, there's always that positive, there's always that blessing at the end, okay? It always balances it out. So if we try to exclude that, we've excluded life itself. So I always ask, what occupies space or time in your mind? Because those are the things that usually need to be balanced, okay? Like this guy who's infatuated with every girl for about 3 months and then has to get the tattoo, and then, a month later dumps her. He was infatuated. He thought only the positive, put her up on this pedestal, and then when he realized that she snores or whatever, all of a sudden, the pendulum swings the other way and he sees everything negative about her. Like he could only see positive, and now all of a sudden that equation is balancing, and all he's seeing is these negatives because he swung the other direction. And he's like, oh my gosh. And now he, went from that infatuation to resentment. She's getting crossed off the list and he's going to the next one. And that's kind of those people who don't live life consciously, who don't actively seek to see that balance. Okay, what he should have done is, okay, I'm infatuated with this girl. I have to sit down if I want to keep her in my life, and I have to balance that equation. I have to look at all the positives, and then I have to find a negative for every positive. And when I can balance that out, now I'm seeing that person in unconditional love, So, I'm not even going to go into that. I am going to go into that. Okay. So, guilt, anger, fear, those are very low consciousness, level fields, all right? And again, if we're not living life consciously, we're going to let these fields kind of drag us down to that level. And at that level, again, we're usually accessing a part of our brain that's very animalistic. It's just looking to go towards pleasure and away from pain. Okay, it usually leads to self-medicating. All right. So I think it's important to understand, where do these things come from? All right. Where do we lie to ourselves about these things to get into that situation? And if we can understand that, I think it raises us to a higher level where we're not going to be as affected by these fields as we would if we weren't living life consciously, okay? So guilt. Let's talk about guilt. Where does guilt come from? Well, it comes from the past, right? Something in our past. Usually, we have perceived that we have caused someone else in our life, probably that we love, more pain than pleasure, more negative than positive, okay? Now, is that true? We know we can't, right? There's always going to be a positive that balances have to sit down, if possible, with that person and list out, okay, I hurt you here. Whatever I did, I hurt you. And I'm sorry, but I need to understand, what were all the negatives that came out of this? And then, were there any positives? Were there any blessings? Was there anybody that came into your life because I hurt you or whatever and moved out of that position? Was there anybody that came into that position and filled that position that was a blessing? Or were there people that blessed you because of this? What were the positives? And that's a tough thing to do. I'm not saying it isn't, but I think it's necessary to identify those lies in our mind, okay? So that lie, guilt, comes from my perception that I caused, my family, my wife, my kids, whoever, more negative than positive, okay? When I balance that out, that guilt is gone. Same thing with anger. That's sort of something in the past usually, okay? But it usually goes like this. In my past, my perception is that someone else has caused me more negative than positive, okay? It's easy to get into that anger state too. And just to share a personal story, when I was 17 years old, I got my head stepped on by a bull on my uncle's farm. And I think it could have been real easy because I lost my hearing and I went through some tough times there. It probably would have been real easy for me to have that anger, okay? But every time it even crept in there, it was like just God saying, well, here's a positive for you. Here's somebody who's going to reach out and love you. Here's, that bull was insured. This is going to pay for your college. This is going to get you to a position where you would have never been able to get had you not had this, this whole experience. And when I look back now, it wasn't easy to do at the time, okay? Because I'm not that master. But in hindsight, we'll usually be able to look back at that situation or that scenario and say, okay, now in hindsight I can see, yeah, these were all the negatives, and I knew all those, but I didn't see all these positives that came out of it, and it's equal. Okay, so I can see that whole situation now in that equilibrium and have unconditional love for that situation. So that's the guilt and the anger. Okay, and that's how we balance those things out. And it might take time. It definitely does. But fear, where does fear come from? Fear is usually just a perception of something that's going to happen in the future, right? It's not even, it isn't even real yet. It hasn't even happened. But most of the time, it's us looking ahead and saying, in the future, I'm going to experience more negative than positive because of X, Y, Z. Hasn't happened yet. It's a complete fabrication of our irrational mind, okay? But when we can identify that and say, okay, I'm looking at something that doesn't exist, probably isn't even going to happen, but my irrational brain is putting together this terrible scenario, and I'm afraid that it's going to come to fruition, that I'm going to have more negative than positive. When Casey, our adopted daughter, went on a training trip with the swim team to Hawaii, what was my irrational fear? I had 3 irrational fears, okay? I was afraid that she was going to, number 1, fall in a volcano. Number 2, get eaten by a shark. Number 3, plane crash, okay? Those were my top 3. She was like, I'm not going anywhere near a volcano, okay, number 1. Number 2, shark attacks are pretty rare, and I'm not even really going to be going into the ocean. We're going to be swimming in a pool the majority of the time, go back to our hotel, pass out, wake up, go do it again. We don't really have a lot of time for that. And the plane crash thing, I can't help it. It's probably not going to happen. Okay? That was my irrational fear. And when I said it out loud, I started laughing. Like, you're literally afraid that she's going to fall into a volcano, get eaten by a shark, or her plane's going to crash. When you say it out loud, a lot of times that balances out that fear. Okay? Sometimes it's just outright goofy. So, not going to go over that. So we desire to change what we don't love. Okay? That unconditional state. It's balance. That's love. Okay? If we don't love something, then it's the grass is always greener on the other side type of Will of God, equilibrium. Imbalance, that's a lie that usually we've created or accepted in our mind. And I wanted to lead with this. My grandma used to have this on the wall in the living room, and it was just always an inspiration to me. It always kind of brought me to tears, but it says, "My name is I am." Now, I am, I went over it in the last one, but I didn't go over it, is a statement of eternal presence, okay? Eternal context. So, my name is I am. I was regretting the past and fearing the future, and suddenly my Lord was speaking. He said, "My name is I am." He paused, I waited, he continued. When you live in the past with its mistakes and regrets, it's hard. I am not there. My name is not I was. When you live in the future with its problems and fears, it's hard because I am not there. My name is not I will be. When you live in this moment, it's not hard because I am here. My name is I am. That's not anywhere in the Bible or anything. It's written by Helen Malacott. But notice how it references when you live in the future, when you live in the past, where you have this fear, you have this guilt. This was long before I knew anything about the field, or I was probably barely could read when I saw this, and it just stuck in my head. I usually try to apply these principles to all the different areas of my life. Okay, so if we're talking about right now, what am I struggling the most with? It's a social, right? It's a family. It's a mental. It's all of those things kind of mixed together when I'm dealing with, Dr. Sean being gone. So I have to take each of those areas where that thing is affecting me, and I have to look at all the positives and all the negatives. Right now, it's easy for me to see all the negatives in, my work life right now because I don't have them here. So I can list all the negatives very easily, but it's harder for me to go through and list the positives, and they don't all show up right away. So it's kind of like as time goes by, I'm able to fill in those blanks, and those positives show up. But I know everybody's struggling. If they're not struggling with this, they're struggling with something. And like I said, just having this knowledge and being able to apply these principles, it's helped my heart tremendously. On Monday morning after he passed, I was in my room just bawling, just praying, because I didn't think I could tell everyone who was going to come in. I'm looking at my book. There was over 100 people in the book that day, and I'm going to have to tell every one of those people what happened. Okay, and they're going to cry, and they're going to be hurt, and they're going to, it's going to be rough. And every time that I did it, every time I walked through that pain, on the other side, there was a blessing there. And I had endurance. I could do another one. I had strength. I could do another one. It was building that character in me, okay? And then by the end of the day, my heart hurt physically less. So I want you guys to get to that state, no matter what you're dealing with, where your heart actually is feeling good again. It's not going to be zero pain, probably this side of heaven, but we can get to a point where we can function, we can love somebody, we can forgive somebody, okay? Thank you guys for coming. I hope this clarifies it a little bit, and I didn't want to do the mental acrobatics, and I really just wanted to speak. This is what I'm dealing with, this is what a lot of us are dealing with, and I hope that people can use this knowledge and some of these principles at least to identify when they're going through something that, maybe they could actually improve, okay? So thanks again for coming. Thanks for joining us online. As usual, anybody who shows up at these or watches online, if you haven't been checked, get checked. It's no charge, and we give you 2 free adjustments to test us out as well, okay? Thanks, and have a great evening.